The sound of chitin snapping echoed through the excavation pit, but it did not come from a quorum shell. Alexander stood over the twitching toxic lurker, his arms coated in a pulsating, obsidian-slick layer of organic plating that had erupted from his skin. With a casual, almost bored motion, he twisted the beast's primary reaping arm until the joints exploded into green ichor. An hour earlier, the only thing breaking was the steady, vertical line of smoke from the temple incense stick. It rose into the stagnant air of the dig site, as predictable and fragile as the soft-skinned creature sitting beneath the quorum scaffolds. Mira watched the human from her elevated dais, her multifaceted eyes tracking the way he meticulously cleaned a fragment of ancient ceramic. Dust clouds from the grinding machines swirled around him, coating his tan skin in a fine, gray powder that made him look like a statue of a forgotten age. As a temple priestess, Mira found his presence both an affront to her station and a nagging source of curiosity that she couldn't quite prune from her mind. He was a specimen, a biological oddity kept for study. Yet he moved through the site with a quiet, domestic grace that felt entirely out of place among the jagged stone and heavy industrial machinery. The incense stick burned beside him, its smoke rising in a perfectly straight pillar, signifying the absolute stillness of the air and the perceived safety of the excavation. Mira felt a strange, internal hum in her secondary heart, a reluctant desire to understand why such a fragile thing didn't simply shatter under the weight of the atmosphere. Insignificant, and yet, he possessed a strange utility that the larger quorum laborers lacked. While they used brute force to crack the planet's crust, the human Alexander spent his hours repairing the delicate relics they inadvertently crushed. His hands were small, lacking the powerful pincers of her people, but they possessed a dexterity that Mira found disturbingly fascinating. She watched him work, her own shell clicking softly in a rhythm of disdain she didn't entirely feel. "He reads to the hatchlings in the lower creche," Mira remarked to her attendant, her voice a series of dry, clicking resonations that carried across the observation deck. "They adore him, though I cannot fathom why they find comfort in a creature that looks like it would bruise if a stiff wind caught it." He flinched when the overhead capacitor sparked, his eyes darting toward the horizon with a look of genuine apprehension. Mira released a puff of pheromones that signaled amusement to her subordinates. It was well known among the excavation crew that the human was terrified of the electric storms that frequently rolled over the site, sentries of the planet's hostile ecosystem. "He's scared of storms," she noted, tapping a pincer against the stone railing. The attendant chattered in agreement, mocking the way the human would huddle in the temporary shelters at the first sign of a darkening sky. To the quorum, who were built to withstand the pressure of deep-sea trenches and the grinding of tectonic plates, such a display of cowardice was the ultimate proof of human inferiority. The alarm klaxon tore through the rhythmic grinding of the excavators. From the lightless vents in the pit floor, a toxic lurker emerged. It was a mass of chitinous plates and dripping venom, and it hissed against the stone while the quorum fled, but Alexander remained. Its presence was a death sentence for any unarmored worker. Panic erupted among the laborers, their heavy carapaces clacking in terror as they scrambled for the lift platforms. Mira stood frozen on the dais. She watched the lurker pivot its massive, segmented head toward the center of the pit, where the human remained seated. And yet, he did not run. He did not even stand at first, which seemed like a tactical error born of sheer, paralyzing fright. He merely set down the ceramic fragment with a delicacy that defied the screeching nightmare lunging toward him. The incense plume, once a steady guide of vertical smoke, now saw its plume scatter into chaotic swirls. The jaw clenched once. Then his whole body relaxed. There was a silence in his stillness that felt heavier than the machinery. Myra's multifaceted eyes struggled to process the lack of a flight response. A human should be a pathetic puddle of adrenaline and terror. Instead, he looked almost bored, his eyes fixed on the beast with a clarity that was deeply unnatural. The lurker lunged, its reaping arms raised high to bisect the soft-skinned intruder. That was when the shadows around Alexander began to move, not as mere light play, but as a physical, viscous reality that defied the laws of the excavation site. The obsidian plating did not merely grow. It erupted from his pores like a sudden, violent infection of power. It was a symbiote, a living organic armor that flowed over his limbs like cooling lava, yet moving with the terrifying speed of a firing synapse. Mira felt her shell shut tight instinctively, her pincers crossing over her chest in the universal quorum gesture of absolute, primal fear. This was not the creature she had studied for months. This was something that looked at a toxic lurker, a beast that could kill a quorum warrior in seconds and saw a minor nuisance. In that moment of contact, the science of his biology shifted into an overdrive that no quorum could replicate. The vagus nerve in humans usually acts as a brake on the heart, maintaining a steady rhythm, but under the influence of the symbiote it functioned as an instant override. It purged all hesitation and fear to allow for pure, unadulterated kinetic output. He moved faster than quorum optics could track, a blur of black glass and predatory intent. The human stepped into the lurker's guard, his armored hands moving in a singular, devastating motion. He simply reached out and twisted the arm off. The lurker's shriek was cut short as Alexander threw the massive, dripping limb aside as if it were a piece of discarded trash. He was a whirlwind of black glass and efficiency, dismantling the threat with a surgical coldness that made the previous mockery of the quorum feel like a suicide note. Mira watched, her secondary heart hammering against her ribs with a violence that threatened to crack her inner shell. The attendant beside her was silent now, mandibles clicking in a frantic mess. "The storm is scared of him," Mira whispered, the dark humor of her own previous arrogance tasting like ash in her throat. Alexander stood in the center of the ichor-stained dust, the black armor retracting into his skin as if it had never been more than a shadow. He looked down at his hands, then at the scattered, twitching remains of the lurker that was already beginning to dissolve. "I didn't break anything that won't heal," he said, his voice flat and calm. But the worldview Mira had carefully constructed lay in ruins on the blood-stained pit floor. She looked at the incense stick, her last anchor to the morning's order. It had snapped under the pressure of the air displacement during the struggle, the tiny ember dying in the cold, gray dust. There was no smoke left to track, no pillar of stability to return to. She realized then that every moment she had spent protecting him, she had been witnessing a choice. It wasn't that he couldn't kill. It was that he was choosing not to. He was a predator who had decided to be a repairman, a monster who preferred the company of hatchlings to the thrill of the hunt. His gentleness was never weakness. It was permission. Do you dare look into the shadows of your own allies and see the monsters waiting for permission? Remember, the truth is often heavier than the lies we tell ourselves to feel safe.